The wind howled over the cliffs of Senlac Hill, dragging with it the salt breath of the English sea. The dawn was pale and bruised, and the sky hung low like a heavy blade above the camp of the Normans. Rows of tents flapped restlessly in the chill morning air, men murmured their prayers, others whispered oaths, and the smell of damp earth mingled with sweat, iron, and fear. Sir Guillaume de Rouen sat alone beside a dying fire. His sword lay across his knees, the edge still dark from yesterday's sharpening. He ran a thumb along its length, feeling the cold steel bite his skin. It was the same blade that had belonged to his father, and, since spring, shared by his brother Etienne. Etienne, who now slept in the next tent over, dreaming perhaps of home, or of the farm by the Seine where their mother once sang by the river. Guillaume had not dreamt in weeks. He could hear the murmur of soldiers, the clinking of chainmail, the muted cough of horses. Far off, priests moved through the ranks, blessing men with hurried Latin, their hands trembling from exhaustion. Deus vult, they said. God wills it. Guillaume wondered if God had willed all the graves left behind in Normandy. The night before battle was always the same, a hollow quiet filled with everything left unsaid. Etienne had asked him, only hours ago, "Do you think we'll make it home?" Guillaume had smiled, not because he believed it, but because hope was easier than truth. He rose, stretching the ache from his legs, and looked toward the east where the sun would soon break the sky. Beyond that horizon lay the English army, dug into the ridge like a waiting beast. Harold's men, fierce, proud, doomed perhaps, but not yet broken. Between them and the sea stretched a field that would drink deeply before dusk. "Guillaume," a voice called softly. Etienne emerged from the fog, his young face pale beneath his helmet. His eyes, the same shade of gray as the sky, trembled with the weight of unspoken fear. "You couldn't sleep either," Guillaume said. Etienne shook his head. "I keep thinking of home. Of father's forge. The smell of smoke. Do you think he'd be proud of us?" Guillaume hesitated, then placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "He'd be proud that you're still standing." Etienne smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "And if I fall tomorrow? Then I'll carry your name with mine," Guillaume said. "Until the end." They stood in silence, two brothers in a foreign land, waiting for the storm to break. A horn sounded from the ridge, long and low. The camp stirred. Men began to move, tightening straps, drawing blades, whispering last prayers. Horses neighed nervously as the sky bled from gray to crimson, the color of omens. Guillaume strapped his helmet on and lifted his shield. The world narrowed to the weight on his shoulders, the cold on his breath, and the steady heartbeat of the man beside him. Etienne looked at him one last time. "See you on the other side, brother." Guillaume nodded, his throat too tight for words. The banners of Normandy unfurled in the wind, crimson lions on white, as the army began its slow, dreadful march toward history. The sea roared behind them like a warning. The ground shuddered with the first steps of thousands of men who believed they were chosen by God. And above it all, the gulls circled and cried, as if mocking the arrogance of kings and the foolish courage of those who bled for them. The sun climbed through a haze of ash and mist, turning the field into a canvas of ghostly gold. Drums echoed through the valley, steady and slow, until they became the heartbeat of an empire about to be born. Guillaume felt each beat in his chest, heavy, rhythmic, merciless. Around him, the Norman ranks formed lines, shields raised, lances pointed forward, faces pale beneath steel. Across the hill, the Saxons stood shoulder to shoulder behind their shield wall, a wall of wood and flesh, of men who would not yield. Their war cries rolled down the slope like thunder, raw and defiant. Guillaume could see their banners fluttering in the wind, the golden dragons of Wessex glinting in the morning light. They were fewer, but their spirit was fierce. A horn sounded, sharp, unrelenting, and the first wave began. Guillaume spurred his horse forward. The ground trembled beneath the charge, hooves drumming against the soil. The sound was deafening, the roar of horses, the clash of armor, the scream of men meeting their fate. As they neared the hill, arrows darkened the sky, falling like rain. One struck Guillaume's shield, splintering against the iron rim. Another buried itself in the neck of the rider beside him, who toppled wordlessly to the earth. They slammed into the Saxon wall like a tide against stone. The first impact was chaos, lances shattered, swords clanged, men shouted in agony. Guillaume swung his blade downward, feeling it bite through wood and flesh. He did not see faces, only movement, only survival. Etienne was still beside him, fighting with the wild desperation of youth. His strikes were fast, his breathing ragged. "Hold the line!" Guillaume shouted. But the line was already breaking. The Saxons pushed back with fury, their axes rising and falling in brutal rhythm. Blood slicked the grass, turning the ground into a graveyard of bones and mud. A horn cried again, "Retreat!" Guillaume pulled his horse back through the chaos, the screams of dying men following him like shadows. Behind him, Etienne turned to cover his flank, and that was when Guillaume saw it. An axe, thrown from the ridge. It spun once, twice, and found Etienne's neck. The sound was small, almost gentle, but it shattered Guillaume's world. He leapt from his horse, cutting his way through the crush of bodies, slipping in blood, choking on dust. Etienne lay on his side, his eyes wide, his lips moving but no words came out. Guillaume fell to his knees, lifting his brother's head. "Stay with me," he whispered, pressing a trembling hand against the wound. But the blood would not stop. It poured through his fingers like wine through broken glass. Etienne's hand rose, weakly, finding Guillaume's arm. His eyes, the same gray as the morning sky, were already fading. "Home," he mouthed. And then he was gone. For a moment, the noise of battle disappeared. Guillaume heard nothing, only the echo of his brother's voice, the sound of waves against the shores of Normandy, the memory of laughter. The world became still, cruelly still. Then a sword clanged against his shoulder, snapping him back into the storm. Rage flooded through him, cold and pure. He rose, sword in hand, and threw himself into the ranks of the Saxons. Every strike was blind, driven not by duty or honor, but grief. He fought until his arms burned, until his legs gave way, until the world blurred into color and pain. By the time the Normans broke through the wall, Guillaume's armor was slick with blood, some his, some not. He did not see victory, only ruin. The Saxons fell, their shields shattered, their banners torn. The hill was covered with corpses, a mountain of the dead. And above it all, William's banner, the dragon of Normandy, fluttered in triumph. The Duke had won his crown. But Guillaume felt only the weight of the body he could not carry home. He sank to his knees beside Etienne, surrounded by the silence that follows slaughter. The sun sank behind the ridge, red as blood, and the crows began to gather. Night fell over Hastings like a shroud. The battlefield, once alive with the clash of men and iron, was now a graveyard. Fires burned low among the wreckage, casting trembling light over broken shields and twisted bodies. The cries of the wounded drifted through the darkness, a low, endless moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. Guillaume lay where he had fallen, half buried beneath corpses. His breath came shallow, each inhalation thick with the stench of blood and smoke. For a time, he did not know if he lived or died. The world had narrowed to pain and silence, to the cold weight pressing on his chest, Etienne's lifeless hand. When he finally moved, it was with the heavy, aimless strength of the damned. He pushed himself free, crawling through the dead until he reached open ground. Around him, the field stretched like a scar, littered with torn banners and fragments of men. A horse screamed somewhere in the distance before falling silent forever. Guillaume dragged himself toward the nearest fire, his hands slick with mud and blood. Every step was agony. His sword was gone, his armor dented and stained black. He no longer felt like a knight, only a man stripped bare of purpose. A priest passed him, whispering last rites to the dying. Guillaume watched as the man knelt beside a Saxon, crossing himself with trembling fingers. The enemy, no longer enemy now, just another broken soul. The priest's Latin was faint, almost tender, lost beneath the whispering wind. When their eyes met, the priest paused. "You live," he said softly, his face pale in the firelight. Guillaume nodded, though it felt like a lie. "For what?" The priest did not answer. He only touched Guillaume's shoulder and moved on, disappearing into the darkness among the dead. Guillaume turned his gaze upward. The sky was full of smoke, but through it he could still see a few stars, cold, distant, untouched by the ruin below. He thought of Etienne again, of the promise he had made, "I'll carry your name with mine." But what did that mean now, when names were swallowed by the soil? A trumpet echoed from the ridge, the signal of victory. William's men were gathering, raising their banners high. The Duke himself had survived, his rule secured. Normandy had triumphed. Triumphed. The word felt hollow in Guillaume's mouth. Around him, the living stumbled among the dead, searching for comrades, for loot, for something that might justify the slaughter. Some laughed. Others wept. The earth beneath them was slick with blood, and yet they called it holy ground. Guillaume sank to his knees, hands trembling. "Victory," he muttered, staring at the bodies around him. "If this is victory, what is defeat?" No one answered. Only the wind moved through the field, carrying the scent of ash and iron. He closed Etienne's eyes with a shaking hand and stayed there until dawn, a lone figure among the remnants of glory. When the morning light came, pale and pitiless, it revealed what the night had hidden: the broken spears, the trampled banners, the faces of boys who had died believing God had chosen them. Guillaume rose at last, his legs unsteady, his heart heavier than armor. The other knights gathered to march north with William, to claim the crown of England. But Guillaume turned away. He could not march any farther. He had seen the cost of crowns. He walked alone through the field, past the dead and dying, past the banners that meant nothing anymore. The wind carried the faint echo of his brother's voice, not a cry, not a plea, only the quiet whisper of a memory. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, the army was already gone. The crows circled above him, their cries sharp and hungry. Guillaume did not look back. He was leaving more than the battlefield behind. He was leaving everything that had once defined him: knight, warrior, servant of a cause he no longer believed in. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly free, and utterly lost. The road stretched before Guillaume like a wound that refused to close, endless, bleeding, silent. Each step away from Hastings felt both heavier and lighter, as though the ghosts of that cursed field clung to his boots, whispering through the mud. Days passed, though he no longer counted them. His armor, once polished and proud, now hung dull and battered upon his shoulders. He carried no banner, no horse, no shield, only the faint ache of survival. The world around him had turned gray, fog rolling over the hills, ravens perched on the bones of the fallen, the smell of damp earth and rot. At night, he dreamed. He dreamed of Etienne standing beside him again, laughing the way he used to before the war, light-hearted, alive. In the dream, his brother would say, "You'll come home soon, won't you?" But when Guillaume reached for him, the smile would fade, and the blood would bloom once more across Etienne's chest. He would wake in the darkness, heart pounding, his hand clutching the empty air where his sword used to be. Sometimes, he found villages burned to ash, Saxon settlements, raided by Norman patrols. Sometimes, he found Saxon men strung from trees, their eyes open to the sky. He could not tell who was right anymore. Every banner looked red beneath the dawn. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Guillaume came upon a small cottage at the edge of a river. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, and the faint sound of a woman's voice carried through the mist. He hesitated, afraid, not of her, but of what he might bring with him. The war followed him like a shadow. But exhaustion won. He knocked once and waited. The door opened. A woman stood there, middle-aged, with pale eyes and a face carved by loss. Behind her, 2 children stared in silence, clutching each other. She looked at him not with fear, but with a weary understanding. "You're not the first," she said quietly, after studying his armor. "And you won't be the last. Come in, stranger." She gave him bread and a place by the fire. The warmth almost broke him, it felt undeserved. For hours, he sat there without speaking, watching the flames flicker across the walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, almost foreign to his own ears. "I fought at Hastings," he said. Her eyes lowered. My husband too." The silence between them grew heavy, filled with everything neither dared to say. Later that night, when the cottage had gone still, Guillaume stepped outside. The moon hung low over the water, and the river murmured softly, as if speaking a language older than grief. He knelt at its edge, his reflection broken by ripples. "I should have died with you," he whispered, thinking of Etienne. Maybe that would have been mercy. But death had passed him by, and now he bore the burden of remembering. That was its own kind of punishment, to live when others could not. He stayed at the cottage for 3 days. On the morning he left, the woman pressed a small wooden cross into his hand. "For the road," she said. "And for the ones you lost." He nodded, unable to speak. The children watched him go from the doorway, silent and wide-eyed. As he walked away, he realized he no longer feared the silence. It was the noise, the echo of battle, the clash of metal, the scream of dying men, that haunted him. Now the wind carried only whispers and the creak of trees. It was a cruel kind of peace, but peace nonetheless. He crossed the countryside alone, sleeping under trees, drinking from streams, following the stars that once guided him to war. And slowly, as weeks turned to months, the dreams began to change. Etienne no longer bled in them. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes, he simply stood in the fog, watching, not accusing, not forgiving, only waiting. One evening, as Guillaume looked toward the horizon, he realized he no longer knew where he was heading. Normandy felt like another lifetime. Perhaps, he thought, the only home left to him was the one he could build with his own 2 hands. And so he kept walking, not as a knight, not as a conqueror, but as a man searching for something beyond victory, for something that might still make him human. Years passed like fading echoes. Guillaume no longer counted them. Time had softened around him, like mist clinging to the hills of northern Normandy, where he had finally stopped wandering. He built a small home at the edge of a field, nothing grand, nothing that would remind him of the banners and castles of kings. Just a roof, a hearth, and the quiet company of the wind. He farmed the land with his hands, scarred, trembling, still bearing the memory of the sword. The soil was heavy but honest. It gave back what he offered it: labor, sweat, patience. In the mornings, he would rise before dawn, listen to the world waking, the murmur of birds, the creak of the trees, and sometimes he would think he heard Etienne's laugh somewhere in that soft, living silence. But it was never truly gone, the war. It lived in the edges of his dreams, in the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, in the cry of a wounded animal. It lived in him. At night, when the moon was bright, he would sit outside and stare across the fields, imagining the ghosts of those he had known, both friend and foe, walking side by side through the fog. They no longer wore armor, no longer bore swords. They were just men again. Sometimes travelers passed through, young knights heading to new wars, filled with pride and certainty. They would stop at his cottage, asking for food or shelter. Guillaume would offer both, but little else. When they spoke of glory, his eyes would darken, though he said nothing to dissuade them. Words could not teach what only blood could. One evening, a young soldier asked him. "Old man, were you ever in battle?" Guillaume stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said finally. "Once. Long ago." "Did you win?" the soldier pressed, his face bright with naive fascination. Guillaume looked up, and for the first time in years, a bitter smile touched his lips. "No one wins," he said quietly. "Some just live long enough to see what victory costs." The boy did not understand. He nodded politely and went to sleep, dreaming of songs and banners. Guillaume watched him with pity, as one might watch a man stepping blindly toward the edge of a cliff. When dawn came, the soldier rode off, waving farewell. Guillaume stood by the fence until the sound of hooves disappeared into the distance. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, but also strangely peaceful. The world no longer needed his sword, and he no longer needed to carry it. That afternoon, he walked to the small hill behind his house where he had planted a wooden cross years before, a grave without a body. Etienne's name was carved into it, rough but clear. Guillaume knelt beside it, resting his calloused hand on the earth. "They crowned their king," he murmured. "They called it peace. But I think peace was never theirs to give." A wind rose, gentle and cold, stirring the grass around him. For a moment, the sound was almost like laughter, faint, familiar, fleeting. He closed his eyes. When the villagers found him the next morning, he was still there, kneeling, as if in prayer, his face turned toward the dawn. The wooden cross cast a long shadow beside him. They buried him next to it, and with time, both graves became one. The fields grew wild again, covering the stones, the memories, the blood that once had shaped the earth. Only the wind remembered their names.